Yeah, and I did sort of get involved at a very young age through the nature centers and environmental education programs that are actually pretty abundant in Arlington. Um, and a lot of the naturalists in the region, the local amateur biologists and botanists, really inspired me. Um, so I hold that very dear to heart. I went to junior high college in Pennsylvania. I studied plant ecology there, and I got really interested in plant insect interactions. So I decided I wanted to continue my education, do a graduate degree in entomology. So right now I'm at the University of Maryland um, in Karen Burkhart's lab, and she's actually a past student of Doug Talamy's. If you guys, he's fairly famous around the region for promoting native plants. The Burkhart lab focuses on plant insect interactions in managed and human dominated landscapes like farms and cities, suburbia. Specifically, I'm looking at, I study overwintering insect ecology, and specifically how leaf litter management techniques can preserve overwintering insects. Each fall we rake our leaves, bring it to the curb, etc. And that potentially is harmful for the many insects that overwinter there. So yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I do have a project where I'm manipulating leaf litter and I'm using these they're called emergence traps to compare the different leaf litter management strategies. I'm working with about 20 homeowners in the College Park area, as well as study at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So hopefully I'll have data to present on that soon. But I'm excited to be back in Maryland. Maryland is awesome. This whole area is really awesome. It has so many diverse and a few rare natural plant communities. The natural plant community is basically a way of categorizing the different plants, and it's basically a way of categorizing ecosystems based upon the plants and the geology of the area. And we're really lucky to live where we are because we're kind of at like the four corners of diversity here. We have the north and the south climate kind of mixing here, and we also live at this so-called fall line, right where Great Falls is. It's sort of this designation between this Piedmont and coastal plain geology. The Piedmont is, think like upland, rocky, hard soil, and think of the coastal plain as more sandy, soft soil. So there's a lot of rare species that live here, especially along the Potomac River. And Maryland has a lot of rare plant communities too, especially wetlands, seepage wetlands that you wouldn't think where they were. They'd be like under an overpass or something like that. Today I'm going to be talking about fairly common plant communities though. I don't think there's too many rare plants that we'll talk about, but that's great because it means you can go out and you can find them fairly easily yourself this spring. And spring is right around the corner, even though we have a storm coming tomorrow night, I think. I am excited for that. I missed out on a lot of snow last year. So anyway, the two plant communities that you'll mainly find spring ephemerals in, and these communities have these fancy names. They also have like number of digits associated with it. But generally, there's this dry, mesic upland forest that's hilly, and then you have this rich floodplain forest, more sandy soil. And the floodplain of a stream or a river that's the area that's going to flood every time the big downpour or something happens. And it can be fairly wide, actually. There's some huge floodplain forests in the area. And this is why you don't build your house too close to a river because when it floods, you don't really know necessarily where that water could come up to. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the plant species that live in these areas now, but I'm going to go through most of them later. So in this upland community, your trees that you're going to find tulip tree, hickory. Sort of in the shrub layer, you'll find spice bush, and then on the herb layer, mayapple, jack in the pulpit, things like that. And then let's say you go downhill a little bit, you get closer to the stream, you're going to have bluebells, pawpaws, big sycamores, box elders. Um, at the same time, there's not really a hard line between the different plant communities, and you'll definitely find, you'll probably find bluebells in the mesic forest, and you'll probably find mayaples in the floodplain forest. But this is a way of designating different habitats. So I'm going to try and structure this presentation based along this divide. So first we'll talk about the basic mesic forest, and then I'll talk about this floodplain forest. And I'm also going to try and structure it based on time, based on bloom time. So the first things I talk about are the things that you can go out maybe in a couple weeks and see. Now, where can you see them? I'm not going to go through where you can find each individual plant at each specific location, because actually they're really all over the place around here. But here's some of the best places you can look. Riverbend Park in Fairfax, Great Falls, Turkey Run. This is on the Virginia side. On the Maryland side, you have Bear Island, Rock Creek Park, Sligo Creek, which is a fairly long park. It starts in Silver Spring, and then Greenbelt Park. Probably maybe a little farther away from DC for most of you, I don't know, is the Patuxent Research Refuge. Beautiful area. The northern parts have wonderful floodplain forest. And you can also find that if you go along the WB&A rail trail towards this upper area in the corner. The floodplain forest where you're really going to find the bluebells, and I'll talk about them later because they get me most excited. That was my picture here. Those are the bluebells. The floodplain forest that you're really going to find those, they're going to be along the Potomac River, but you can also find them along the Patuxent River. So the first spring ephemeral I'm going to talk about is called the Harbinger of Spring. And this is going to start coming out pretty soon. It's been fairly snowy, so maybe it'll take a little longer, but late February, early March is when this guy's really going to come out. And I think I should go over what a spring ephemeral is now, but this is a real good example of what a spring ephemeral is. It blooms really early in the spring, and it's going to have a fairly short life cycle. It's going to grow, it's going to set seed, and then it's going to die back. And that's kind of key. Generally, these plants, the above ground plant material is going to die back, and it's going to be maintained year after year by a tuber or a root underground. Now, not all the plants I'm talking about are going to be spring ephemerals, but a good portion of them are. So why would you come out, bloom, and die so quickly? Sometimes these flowers happen for a matter of days and then they're gone. So for those of you who are interested in going out and finding them, being on social media is very helpful because you can find exactly when and where they're blooming. Well, it's a life strategy, really. In the early spring, there's not going to be too many leaves on the trees, and you're going to have basically tons of sunlight. And then there's also this idea that you don't really have too much competition for pollinators. The pollinators coming out of the ground, they're really hungry, they want food, and there's only a few flowering plants they can go to. So you have tons of access to pollinators, and that's kind of the main life history strategy of these guys. So this isn't a carrot family. If you've ever seen a wild carrot, it has this umbel. So you can kind of see that in this plant as well. And one of its other common names is salt and pepper because the difference in its petals and the center part of the flowers kind of looks like salt and pepper, I guess. I don't know. The next one that is going to be blooming fairly soon is Spring Beauty. Spring Beauties, so I said I'm starting in this upland mesic forest. Really, you can find spring beauties everywhere. You can even find them in your yard sometimes if your house abuts a forest, and you might not even know because the leaves look like blades of grass. So only for like a couple weeks in the spring we know if you have them. On this picture on the right, I'm not sure if it's easy for you guys to see, but each one of these white dots is a spring beauty. They absolutely coat the forest floor around here. It almost looks like snow, and bees are buzzing all around these areas. It's really beautiful, but it's hard to take a picture of. So I hope you guys can see that. Have you noticed the flower pictures that I have here look really different? This picture here, the flowers are pinker, and over here they're whiter, and really they can go almost completely white, where you don't see any of these pink pink lines. And this variation is interesting when you find a population that has a variation like this. Generally, natural selection tends to force species towards one outward appearance, and so when you have two, evolutionary biologists get really excited and they want to study why exactly this is happening. And so they did that for the species. And of course, some of the science I'm presenting to you is fairly recent and it not that thoroughly studied, but so this maybe is a work in progress. I think you could maybe phrase it as. But one idea behind the different colors actually has to do with attracting pollinators and preventing against pests. So the gene that codes for the white color in a flower petal, in these particular flower petals, also codes for chemicals in the leaves that make them taste bad to bugs, basically. So you have these white petals because you taste bad for bugs. And then on the other hand, okay, so why would you have these pink flowers? Well, it turns out that pink flowers are more attractive to pollinators. So there's a balance here. In a forest where you're surrounded by just yourself, you probably just want to have white flowers, protect against pests. But if you are in a community of flowers that are white from different species, you want to stand out. You want the pollinator to come to you. And so they found that that's when these pink color morphs appear. These guys are their seeds are dispersed by ants, and I'm going to talk about this a lot later. It's called myrmecochory, and I'll talk about that with my next plant. And you'll find that a lot of spring ephemerals are dispersed by ants, and you'll also find that a lot of spring ephemerals they're going to close up at night, or they'll close up on a cloudy day, and the reason for that is to prevent morning dew or rain from washing pollen away. So if you want to get good pictures of these and really appreciate them, definitely go out on a sunny day. This is the spring beauty bee, and it only feeds on spring beauties. There's a specialist bee, and about, I think this area, about like 25% of bees are specialist bees that only feed on a select few types of flowers, a few families of flowers. So if you see a little bee on spring beauty and something like this, without even pulling out a microscope or anything, it's probably the spring beauty bee here. And I'll talk probably a little bit more about pollinator adaptations, but there's this question: why would you have a specialist bee, or if you were a bee, why would you only visit one type of flower? So if you're a flower and you have a specialist bee, well, that's really great for you. No matter what happens, you've got this buddy that's going to come to you and pollinate you. You're pretty much set. But if you're a bee, why would you limit yourself to only one type of flower? And research of this is still in progress. One idea is that it's more efficient just to visit one type of flower. And also, when you're eating the pollen, maybe you're adapted to digest it better. And bees need pollen. Everyone knows that, but you think of them going after nectar, but the pollen is like real protein, and they need that to reproduce. So here's bloodroot. This is another super early spring ephemeral. And Yeah, it's mostly you're going to find in these upland mesic forests, although it's fairly common around here. Uh, so bloodroot only produces pollen. Bees still come to it because they need that pollen, remember. This is probably going to start blooming in early April, whereas the previous two, probably late March. You can really find them easily, harbinger of spring, early March, of course. So this guy has a strategy. It wants to get pollinated by a insect, a pollinator. That's sexual reproduction, and it helps stop against inbreeding, which is important. But it hedges its bets. If it doesn't get pollinated by an insect, what it'll do, I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse. It has these, this sort of ring out here is the male part of the flower, the anthers. So if after 3 days this plant doesn't get pollinated, the anthers are going to bend forward and touch the female part, transfer the pollen to self-pollinate. It's not the best, but it's better than going unfertilized. So this is another myrmecocorus plant. It's dispersed by ants. And what the ants do is they really love this fleshy appendage called the elaiosome. Now this is not a picture of bloodroot seeds. This is a picture of a trillium that's not found around here. Best I could find. But it's like, think of it like a French fry. It's like fatty, it's greasy. Ants love it, and they'll go and they'll pull this elaiosome down from the plants, and they'll bring it to their nests. And that's where the plants will germinate. Now, it's great and all, but if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense to be pollinated by ants. You want to be it doesn't make sense to be dispersed by ants. You want to be dispersed by something that can go a really long distance, like a bird. Berries, a bird's going to eat a berry and transport it. Or you might want to have a burr and stick onto a deer or a dog or something to transport your food. Why would you rely on something that has really tiny legs and something that doesn't move more than a meter? And it's interesting. We don't really know, but there are hypotheses. So one hypothesis is that, well, the ant nests are really fertile. Okay, so you go to a safe, fertile place. And you'll see as I go through the rest of these spring ephemerals, most spring ephemerals are dispersed by ants. So maybe it's something more than fertile. So two other hypotheses, and I like these. So one of them is that in the early spring, you're going to have a lot of starving seed predators, like mice. And so, they're going to wake up and they're going to be really hungry. And any seed that's on the forest is fair game for them. So they're going to eat it and they're going to destroy it and do bad for that plant. But if you have this relationship with ants, and the ants can overnight take all your seeds and put them into their nests, you can kind of protect them from mice. Okay, I kind of like it. Another one is, and this I think is super interesting. So ants have these mandibles, these jaws, and they have glands. So ants have tons of glands. Like, ants are these huge chemical creatures. But these glands are going to exude this antifungal and antimicrobial substance that they use to keep their nest safe. And as they're eating this elaiosome off of the seed, they're just oozing this sort of ointment on the seeds that are going to protect them. And if you've ever grown like garden seeds in the spring, you know how susceptible they are to fungus and rot. And these guys, they're growing along rivers, it's early spring. So this might be a mechanism, by teaming up with ants to avoid some of that fungal diseases. And, I'm going to mention each of the plants that is dispersed by ants. It's crazy, the number of them. Oh, by the way, this is an Aphaenogaster ant, and that's the ant that's going to make up the majority of the ant biomass, it's called, in our eastern forests. Oh, shoot. Okay, I'm going to speed up. So the This is the bloodroot. All parts of bloodroot is going to exude this red sap, but the root especially. And this sap is used by Native Americans to use as dye and things. It also, so this is a toxic substance. It kills cells. So there was a use for it to try and destroy cancer cells, and people would like rub it on skin cancer. It's not a good idea. The FDA had to come in like the 1950s and tell people, please stop doing this, because it really it will kill your skin cells. So don't get this on your skin, but don't dig it up. And for a lot of these plants I'm going to be talking about, they're going to have these ethnobotanical uses, but you know, these are delicate communities, and we want to be real careful with them. Yellow trout lily. Okay, so now we're moving a little bit more into April, and we're moving a little bit downhill toward closer to the water, towards more of this floodplain area. This one is also dispersed by ants. It's called a trout lily because its leaves are speckled in a way that reminds people of trout, I guess. It takes about 7 years from seed to flower. It's a really long-lived species, and it's clonal. So if you find a flower, you'll probably also find other little trout lilies that are going to stick up. And generally, they'll only have one leaf, and the flowering one is going to have 2 leaves. And yeah, these guys can live for a really long time. It takes them a while to germinate, flower, and then they'll persist for a while, which means that it's actually a really delicate organism to land change and things like that. So the leaves of these plants, if you were to take them and do a chemical assay, you'd find they have huge amounts of nitrogen and potassium. And they're a good example of this thing called the vernal dam hypothesis. And that came out in the 70s, and it's not confirmed or anything, but it's another hypothesis about kind of the ecological role of spring ephemerals. And the idea is that in the spring, you're going to have high snowmelt, a lot of rain, and it's going to wash away a lot of nutrients from forest soils into streams and rivers. And what spring ephemerals can do is they can kind of suck up that nutrients and keep it within their leaves so it doesn't get washed away. And then sort of when the spring rains stop, the snowmelt stops in later summer, and they decompose, they offer that nutrients up to the rest of the forest. So that's called the vernal dam hypothesis, and it's still being debated. You notice some more variation in the flowers, just like the spring beauty. The picture on the left has their male parts of the flower is red, and here it's yellow. And there's actually a citizen science study done, I think it started in 2016. Emily Austin, who I believe was a postdoc at the time, was trying to figure out why there's this difference in anther color, in this male flower part color. And so she said, okay, she sent out this to social media and to a bunch of native plant organizations, and she asked people, send me pictures of your plants, of these flowers. And so she mapped them, and she didn't find anything. These co-occur everywhere along the East Coast and Midwest, and even up into Canada. So she's like, what is causing this? And she did a bunch of tests. She looked at pollination rate. She looked at whether the color of the pollen protects itself against UV radiation. She looked at bugs eating the leaves, which is called herbivory. She really didn't find that much. One possibility is that in certain ecosystems, one flower color might be better for some certain guilds of pollinators. But at most, that's it. And this was very interesting from an evolutionary biology perspective, especially because it's such a long-lived plant. And generally, studies have been done on fruit flies or mice, things that die really quickly, not things that take 7 years to flower. So this might be a case of just well, the scientific word for it is random, is genetic drift, but really just a random set of circumstances. And that combined with long flowering period, long life, might have caused this sort of random variation. Now, there is also the white trout lily. Now, this is a rare plant. This is a state rare to Maryland. But like many rare plants and endangered plants, you'll find that in one state it's rare, but in another state it's super common. So in Illinois, this is very common. But here, you can only find it in select places along the Potomac River. So I'm really lucky that I was able to see this. Okay, we're maybe moving a little bit further down, and maybe we're in mid-April now, around mid-April. So this is Dutchman's Breeches. And it's called Dutchman's Breeches because of the shape of the flower, which, so so breeches are pants, I guess. So they're these pants that they wore in the 1800s. Like George Washington would have worn breeches. I think they came up to your knees, and then you wore like socks or stockings up to that point. So people were like, oh, this is definitely breeches or something. Maybe hanging on a clothesline. Well, each of the legs, so to speak, or the feet, are called nectar spurs. And that's where the nectar is going to be found. And so in order to get there, you need if you're a pollinator, you need a tongue that's long enough to get up into that nectar spur. And in this area, and at this time in the spring, really the only bee that really can do that are bumblebees, specifically queen bumblebees. So that's mainly what you're going to find on these plants. And yeah, so the evolution of flowers is a big can of worms, but the idea, I guess, is that if you're the flower, you're forcing that pollinator to really rub its head on your pollen as much as possible. And so you kind of want your nectar to be in a location where you really have to get into that flower. So that's one reason you might evolve this nectar spur. Another reason might be, you want a pollinator that's very specific to what you want. You want a pollinator that's going to be efficient and is going to visit similar flowers. It's not going to waste pollen on a species unrelated to you. So that's maybe a reason why you try to specialize in a pollinator that is able to drink your pollen. And but of course, whenever you have these tight relationships, there's always somebody that cheats. And so a lot of times you'll find little holes in the tips of the nectar spurs. And that's what they're called, nectar robbers. They'll bite a little hole and they'll just get out the nectar for free. These guys are also found along with squirrel corn. It's in the same genus, but it has a slightly different form. It still has these nectar spurs. It's a little bit less common, I would say. You're probably going to find Dutchman's breeches more than you're going to find squirrel corn, but they do live in the same area. Okay. So now we're pretty much in the floodplain area at this point. And yeah, so how I'm sort of structuring the presentation is based on pretty much what it looks like a turkey run if you were to start at the top of the hill and walk yourself downwards. This is sessile bellwort. And in botany, this word sessile basically means, it means without a stem, but it can also mean touching. And the reason it's called this is because the leaf touches the stem directly, like so. And there's another bellwort that's native here, it's less common, called profoliate bellwort, and that's in which the leaf wraps around the stem. So that's why the common name has this in it, to differentiate between the other one. And if you look at the genus, Uvularia. So there's in the Renaissance time period, there's this thing called doctrine of signatures, and the idea was that a plant would look a certain way. A plant would look like a body part if it could cure that body part, an ailment of that body part. So people said, okay, this kind of looks like a uvula in the back of your throat. It's probably great for sore throats. And so herbalists would prescribe this. Of course, that's a Renaissance idea. Like they said, okay, well, God wants man to know that this is what this plant should be used for. But if you're Native American, you don't really care about that. So they just ate it as asparagus, pretty much. They boil it. This is wild ginger. This is, well, it's a low-lying plant. It'll form a sort of a pretty large colonies on the forest floor. And if you look at its flower here, it's red. It actually, if you smell it, it smells kind of bad. To a fly that's coming out of the ground, this kind of looks like meat. And so it is pollinated by flies. They're going to think it's a piece of meat, want to land on it, maybe lay eggs, and they end up pollinating it. So whenever you see a flower cone that looks like this, and it's actually pretty exact, like if you were to do like color swatches of different petal colors, if it has this color, it's generally pollinated by flies. You know, I can think of, if you've ever seen a pawpaw flower, it kind of has the same color. And there's one more that I'll get to later that has the same color. So it's wild ginger. It's in the birthwort family or the pipevine family. It's not really related to ginger at all. But Native Americans, they would go through this fairly intensive process to dry it and grind it up into powder. And after that, it does give off this gingery aroma, and they used it as a spice. But as with a lot of these spring ephemerals I'm going to be talking about, just because it has, I guess, a cooking utility doesn't mean it's safe. This is actually highly toxic. Like most plants in the birthwort family, so probably the thing that maybe you guys know most that's in the birthwort family is like a pipe vine. So if you know of the pipe vine swallowtail, it's going to eat pipe vine. It's going to incorporate those toxic chemicals that this family has into it to make it distasteful to birds and things. So much so that other butterflies, like the eastern swallowtail, is going to mimic it. Even though it's perfectly safe for birds, it's going to, I think it's perfectly safe for birds. Well, it definitely doesn't have that amount of toxin in it. But anyway, yeah, don't eat the root of this or anything. So the next plant is mayapple. So this is going to bloom in late April, and it's going to have a little fruit in probably May. Yeah, probably early May, I guess. And about now, you can begin, or maybe in a couple weeks, you'll begin to be able to see these little things popping out of the ground that look like aliens almost. But that's the sprout of the mayapple, and you can always tell if that individual plant is going to flower or not because it has a little flower bud on it. These form fairly large populations, or large like clumps. And I wish I had a picture of the fruit, but the fruit is basically this yellow round, maybe the size of a date. Now all parts of this plant are poisonous. You know, you can eat the flesh of the fruit. You can't eat the seeds, but you know, you might be able to eat like the flesh of the fruit. And people in the colonial era would make like mayapple butter or jams. I wouldn't suggest risking it. You don't want to get a little bit of seed in there because it is a highly toxic plant. And if you want to germinate it, you have to, well, first of all, it needs to go through a cold freeze. So it's called cold stratification. You have to put it in your refrigerator. And you also have to take sandpaper and rub it on the seeds. And it's called scarification. And you do that to mimic its wild dispersal mechanism, which are box turtles for the most part. A box turtle will eat it, and it will pass through its digestive system, and that will, like the stomach acid will basically scratch the outside of the shell of the seed, and it'll be like, okay, now it's time to germinate. This plant is super important because its toxin that is poisonous is called podophylotoxin, and the cancer drug etoposide is derived from that, which is like one of the most used cancer drugs. And this is just an example of sort of preserving our wild communities, preserving biodiversity. It does more. It just helps animals. It really can provide access to a lot of medicinal resources. So this is blue cohosh. There's another cohosh called black cohosh, but that blooms later and it's not related to this. This does have nectar, even though it doesn't have showy flowers. So I'm not really sure exactly what pollinates this. It's less common, but you will find it along in these floodplain communities. And it has these blueberries later in the summer. And Native Americans would use this as contraception. But you take too many and you die. So it's like you have to be careful. Finally, to the trilliums. This one is maybe my second favorite. Here you can see that same color. So this is pollinated by bees and beetles and flies. And it's called trillium because it has three of everything: 3 petals, 3 leaves. These things are called sepals, 3 sepals. And it does have another color variation, which is interesting. I don't think there's any studies on that, but some of them have yellow petals, as you can see here in the background. Its leaves are mottled, and we think that's kind of a form of camouflage against deer. If any of you have this planted in your yard, deer absolutely love this plant. So this is kind of a protection against colorblind deer to break up its form in the background. It's called sessile for the same reason as the other one. Many trilliums have their flower come off on a little stalk, but this is flush with a leaf. This is also the most common trillium you're going to find in this area. If you go west of here and you go north of here, you'll be able to find a lot more. But generally in this area, this is the main one. This is the main one that you're going to find. Wild ramps. So we're still in this floodplain community here, and if you're lucky, you could find huge masses of wild ramps. But that's getting rarer and rarer because these guys are an onion family, and they supposedly taste pretty good. I did not pick this. This is from Wikipedia. But there's huge ramp festivals in the area. And people love to fry them and stir fry them and eat them, especially in like Pennsylvania and New York. But it's putting a big dent in populations of wild ramps. And it is one of the major threats to this plant, which used to be all over the place. So Chicago, the word Chicago is actually sort of a French bastardization of the Native American word for this plant. And that's because it grew all over what Chicago now is, which used to be a really nice stream bank community. So yeah, be careful with this. They probably will sell it at farmers markets and things. You just want to make sure that they're not collecting from wild communities, because that is a huge threat to this species. All right, and now my favorite, and probably the thing that this area in terms of spring wildflowers is known for. It's these bluebells. And I'm showing another color morph. This is a white Virginia bluebell. Those are kind of rare. They're mixed in. I think that's more a case of a mutant as opposed to a sustained variation in the plant communities. Kind of like finding a black squirrel almost. But these guys absolutely coat the forest floor in certain areas. It's rare to find them in masses like this. You can find them in masses like this along the Patuxent River in the Patuxent Research Preserve. And you can also find it along Turkey Run. And the main one is Riverbend Park. Riverbend when there wasn't COVID, would do a yearly bluebell festival. And when these bloom, to the date, probably like it generally is April 18th when it's peak season for this. But that's changing year after year. So I've just talked about a few spring ephemerals, and there are many, many more. There are orchids. There are things that last a little bit longer, things you can only find on specific areas. But hopefully this gives an overview of the floristic diversity in this area. And I was, last year, just as spring ephemeral season was starting in mid-April, COVID struck and Turkey Run, Big Falls, it all got shut down. So I didn't get a chance to really get out last year. But hopefully socially distanced this year as we understand the disease more and what's safe and what's not. You'll be able to view these. A really great resource is iNaturalist. If you put in the name of one of these wildflowers into iNaturalist, you can get a pretty exact location, almost to a fault because it will take you to sometimes rare communities. So I don't know how I feel exactly about that. But definitely for things like, if you want to find a mass of bluebells or you want to find trout lilies, that's a really good opportunity. But even if you don't use that, you went to some of those parks, and I'll go back to that slide. At this, a couple weeks at that time of year, you're pretty much going to definitely find spring beauties. If you're lucky, some bloodroot, and so forth. But as with everything, I do have to say this stuff is under threat. Not only from overpicking if it has a particular ethnobotanical use, but also from climate change. Each year, climate change is really doing a number. Trees are leafing out earlier and kind of destroying this life strategy that these spring ephemerals have. There's what's called a phenological mismatch between pollinators emerging from the ground and the flowers that they use. If they don't line up, it's really bad. And then, of course, the big one is invasive species. At one point, I thought this was really beautiful on the right here. This is lesser celandine. But now, in some places, it's all you can find. It's really hard to get rid of. It lives basically right along the water's edge, and it's destroying bluebell communities or bluebell populations and trout lily populations. You have invasive shrubs coming in, and this is kind of similar to sort of the issues of climate change, but generally these shrubs are either evergreen-ish or they're going to leaf out like really soon, maybe in 2 weeks, and they're going to offer shade to these spring ephemerals, which spring ephemerals really hate shade, at least during that growing period that they have. And then we have garlic mustard here. Garlic mustard is allelopathic, and that basically means it puts down these chemicals into the soil that stops surrounding plants from growing well in them. And it spreads by kind of popping its seeds all over the place. You can eat this, so if you are going out to pull invasive plants and you can eat this, you can make a pesto out of it. So yeah, that's what I've got for you guys. I'm going to go back to this slide here. If you guys have any questions, and I guess I haven't looked at the chat, but Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah, I forgot to mention that for this. But yeah, if anybody, I can go through the.
So Max, I've been keeping an eye on the chat here, and so I can sort of bring up a few questions that I saw along the way. Mm-hmm. And just so everyone knows, we do have a bit of time for questions. I think we set 7:30 as our end time for this meeting. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop them in the chat. So I will say one question that I saw early on. Someone asked, how might the cicadas this year impact the flowers?
Sorry, I don't think I'm muted. I don't think they will impact. Most of these flowers are going to be gone by mid-May, and that's when the cicadas are going to come out. Now, trees, on the other hand, could definitely be impacted, but I think most of these flowers are going to be okay in that regard. And generally, the cicadas are going to eat trees. But when you have a lot of cicadas, you have a lot of dead cicadas too. And that's going to be a huge nutrient load into our soils around here. So I would definitely think that, I don't know what, but all that nutrients in the soil is definitely going to have a fairly large effect on all plant communities here.
And then it looks like we have a new question in the chat. Asking again, what's the name of the plants that are pollinated by ants? The term that you use for that process.
Oh, right. That's Myrmecochorus. It's hard to pronounce. Myrmecochorus. Yeah. And that's more than just this region. There's really, that takes place all over the place in the world, even in tropical areas. Super cool.
Okay. Another question here, or urge for more information. Could you talk a bit more about the impact of cicadas and their decaying bodies? So the impact that decay will have in the ecosystem, if you know any more about that.
Oh boy, I wish I knew more about that. Yeah, I could just guess. There are tons of scientific papers. I just haven't read them. I could guess that things that are nutrient limited, that basically means that a plant that is the reason it's not growing more is because it doesn't have nutrients, as opposed to being like sun limited or water limited. So things that are nutrient limited will probably thrive a lot more. Probably thrive a lot more. Yeah, that's for native plants. I can think about like waterways, maybe. Maybe the I don't do too much with streams and rivers, but maybe there's a chance that there'll be algae blooms, something like that. I don't know. Those are great questions. Now I'm really excited to look up some of that information.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm very curious about that as well. The cicada boom is really going to shake up our lives in the near future, and so I think we're going to see some interesting possible new trends.
Yes, that's super. That's super.
Another question that I saw related to all the plants that you've been talking about, whether they're all native, and then I'll sort of add on to that. Would we ever consider a non-native plant to be a spring ephemeral that we would want to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, so I've just talked about native plants. But not all the plants I talked about are necessarily spring ephemerals. Spring ephemerals are the ones that are really going to decompose completely by midsummer. Okay, maybe one that is pretty out there is called I'll say that yellow cordalis. It has these little yellow flowers on it that are in like a tube, and it is a non-native, but I wouldn't consider it to be invasive. And that could be fairly pretty that you might find. Besides that, there's garlic mustard, which is going to bloom in the spring. It has, I guess you could say, it has little tiny white pretty flowers. And then so the other one is the lesser celandine, and that I think it's beautiful, but it's awful. But that's another invasive plant that you'll find in this area during the spring.
Awesome. Two more questions that just came in. The first, what has been the most exciting flower that you've found? If you can answer that question.
Here we go. Probably the most exciting flower, I saw it last year actually in bloom, is this one on the top corner here. This is called, well, it's an orchid actually. And just as I'm thinking of it, the name of it escapes me. Yeah, I can't think of the name. Another orchid is yellow lady slipper. You can't really find that as much in this area, but you might be able to find some pink lady slippers. I'm not exactly sure where they are. So really, any of the orchids are going to be super exciting to me. The other plant here is this one. This is well, see now all of these ones are fading away. This one is
Putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, I'm putting it on the spot. This one's related to the plant that's over, or it's not related to, but its name is the same as the plant that's over harvested in the Appalachians for medicinal purposes, which I forget. But anyway, it's kind of rare, and yeah, dwarf ginseng. There you go. That's it. Awesome. Thank you. This is dwarf ginseng. I get excited when I see this one. I wouldn't say it's as common as some other ones.
Awesome. Another flower specific question. How many trillium types would we find in this area?
That's an interesting question because there's a lot of planted species, even in the wild. So please don't do this. Please don't plant the species from your yard into the wild. I have seen other species like prairie trillium, which is common in Illinois, planted. So in this particular area, I've only seen sessile trillium. I've only seen toadstool. That's the other word. That's the other common name for it. I don't know. Maybe somebody else knows in this direct area. I know you can definitely find Trillium grandifolium in the where is it? In the Virginia mountains. There's a beautiful area that's been preserved by the Virginia Native Plant Society, where you can find that plant. Massive colonies, very big Trillium with huge flowers, and they used to take trips out there. You have to have like a license. It's game land, so you have to make sure, even if you're not hunting, you have to have a license. You can buy like a non-hunting license to see that. I would definitely suggest it. I think it's called Linden Preserve, something like that, in West Virginia. And then as you go up north, you're going to find a lot more types of Trillium. Trillium erectum, I think, is a fairly common one.
And I do feel like I've seen a few spotty instances of Trillium grandifolium just in like random locations in this watershed, but then also further up north a little bit in Maryland. But that, like you say, maybe that's more of an instance of someone taking the plant and planting it in nature.
Yeah, that's a
Would you say that? Yeah. All right, awesome. There are a few more questions that we can hit. Check the time. Oh, we have plenty of time. Oh, this is a great question. Are any of these species better than others for residential yards or easier to grow? Are they available at places like Chesapeake Natives?
Mm-hmm.
So could you speak to native?
I just, because I didn't have time to type. You want to tell us more about your project? Because I've heard you talk about it before.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And
it sounds so interesting. I know you're measuring the bugs and the leaves. How's it going?
It's going good. So let me first respond. So it's showy orchis is that flower. It's showy orchis. So sorry about that. The research is going fairly well. I was recruiting homeowners, but I've done that so far. And yeah, I've using these emergence traps, which collect the insects as they fly to the ground in the spring. And what I've done is I've have these treatments of leaf litter manipulation where I remove leaf litter, I mulch leaf litter, I make a pile of leaf litter, and I can compare what different plants are coming out of, or what different insects are coming out of the ground. And I do it over a couple months, so I can see year after year if certain species are emerging at certain times compared to other times. So the first part of that research took place at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where they have a tree biodiversity project. And that basically is this large scale, they basically planted a forest by hand, and therefore they got to decide which stands of trees were going to be monocultures and which stands of trees were going to be a diverse assemblage. And so I have really exact data on tree species, on temperature, on weather conditions. But then, the purpose of this study is to see how our leaf litter management techniques that we use each autumn. That's sort of that was the basis of the study. So I was sure to take this into suburban places, suburban homes. So I'm working with about 20 homeowners to kind of do a similar study. And really I'm focused on butterflies and moths, as well as parasitoid wasps, which are these little wasps that will lay their eggs in caterpillars. And they're useful for, they're called natural enemies, and they're useful for biocontrol. And so the idea is, if I see the sort of a disconnect between the parasitoid wasps and the caterpillars and the butterflies, I'll be able to learn different things about how the ecosystem functions. But potentially this is kind of a huge destructive element that we do. Most of us, if we own a home, we're told to plant native plants, and we're told to plant native plants so caterpillars can eat them, and then plant pollinator plants so pollinators can enjoy their nectar. But we are kind of ignoring this middle life stage that is potentially super, super important, because if you destroy their populations during this life stage, they're not going to be able to emerge as butterflies. The other thing is, if you have let's say you're raking your leaves and you're removing your leaves each year, that you're potentially setting up what's called a sink population, which is when populations are going to immigrate into your yard in hopes of laying eggs and sort of setting up a life there, and then you're basically killing them. But the population doesn't know, so they keep coming. And so you're basically flushing your insects down the drain. But no research has been done on really any macroinvertebrate in leaf litter. Most of the studies that look at leaf litter disturbance are interested in nutrient dynamics. And I do a little bit of research with that, but the majority of literature out there is in tropical systems, and it doesn't really take into account things that only spend a certain portion of their life in leaf litter. We really don't know anything about where large groups of organisms overwinter. We only know for maybe a few crop species. So yeah, I'm excited.
Great. Any other final questions? All right. Well, with that, I think we will begin to wrap up. I do see two more. All right. Awesome. Yeah, so we'll begin to wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining us for this Watershed Wednesday. And thank you, Max, so much for your presentation. I know that I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it seems in the chat that many other people did as well. So thank you so much. And just so all of you know, we will be having another Watershed Wednesday next month, and we'll be continuing with our spring theme. So next month's Watershed Wednesday will be focused on vernal pools in the region. So if you're interested in getting even more excited about spring, please join us next month as well. All right, well, have a great night, everyone. Thanks again.